A black couple is thrown out of a luxury store by a security guard. But 10 minutes later, he faces an outcome no one saw coming. What led to his shocking downfall? Stick around to uncover the unexpected twist that will leave you questioning everything. Before we get into this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. If you like stories with surprising twists, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. The luxury department store buzzed with activity as well-dressed shoppers browsed through aisles of high-end goods. Among them were Alicia and Marcus Carter, a married couple who seemed to carry an air of quiet confidence. Alicia, wearing a sleek blazer and heels, looked poised as she admired a leather handbag. Beside her, Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, his laid-back smile softening the formal look of his tailored suit. They spoke to each other in hushed tones, laughing occasionally as they moved between displays. Neil Harris, the store's newest security guard, stood by the entrance with his arms crossed. He scanned the room with a critical eye, taking in the shoppers and their movements. Neil had always prided himself on being sharp and proactive, even if it meant making snap judgments. When his gaze fell on Alicia and Marcus, he frowned. Something about them unsettled him, though he couldn't quite say why. They were too comfortable, too at ease, he thought. People like them usually didn't shop in places like this, at least not in his mind. As Alicia reached for a price tag, Neil walked briskly toward them. "Excuse me," he said firmly, his tone loud enough to turn heads nearby. Marcus looked up, startled, while Alicia kept her composure, raising an eyebrow. "Can I help you with something?" Neil continued, his words less a question and more a challenge. Alicia smiled politely. "No thank you. We're just browsing," she replied, her voice steady. Marcus nodded in agreement, stepping closer to his wife as Neil's expression hardened. "This area is for customers only," Neil said, folding his arms. "If you're not planning to make a purchase, I'll have to ask you to leave." For a moment, Marcus froze, his easy smile fading. Alicia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her voice calm. "We are customers," she said, holding Neil's gaze. "And we haven't done anything wrong." Neil smirked. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but people have been watching you. It's better if you just go before we have a problem." Alicia glanced around, noticing the other shoppers now openly staring. Some looked curious. Others whispered behind their hands. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, his jaw tight. "We're not causing any problems," he said firmly, his deep voice steady. "We're just shopping like everyone else." But Neil shook his head, stepping closer. "I'm not going to repeat myself. Leave now, or I'll call for backup." The room seemed to grow quieter, the tension thickening as more eyes turned their way. Alicia's grip tightened on her handbag. She opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus gently squeezed her shoulder, signaling her to let it go. Without another word, they turned and walked toward the exit, their heads held high. As they left, Neil stood tall, feeling a rush of satisfaction. He adjusted his badge and glanced at a nearby coworker, who avoided meeting his eyes. "You've got to keep control," he muttered to himself, just loud enough for others to hear. "Standards have to be maintained." Unbeknownst to him, his actions had already set something much larger in motion, something that would shake the very ground he stood on. Outside the store, Marcus and Alicia sat in their car, the engine idling in silence. Marcus drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, his usually cheerful demeanor clouded by frustration. Alicia sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap, her posture as composed as ever, but her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't one to let such incidents slide easily. Finally, Marcus sighed. "You think we should just let this go?" he asked, his voice tinged with hesitation. "I mean, it's not like it's the first time this kind of thing has happened." Alicia turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "Let it go," she repeated, her tone calm but edged with disbelief. "Marcus, that man humiliated us in front of everyone. We didn't do anything wrong, and he treated us like criminals." "I know," Marcus said, his voice softening, "but people like him don't listen." "Alicia, what good will it do?" Alicia picked up her phone and began typing. "Maybe not for us," she said, her words deliberate. but for the next people who walk in there and get treated the same way. It's not just about us. Marcus watched as she tapped out a message, her fingers moving quickly. Who are you texting? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Caroline. Alicia replied without looking up. Caroline Hastings was not only a close friend, but also the regional director of the department store chain. If anyone could address what had just happened, it was her. You're really doing this, Marcus said, with a small shake of his head. His lips curved into a faint smile, his frustration giving way to admiration. That guard has no idea who he just messed with. Alicia's phone buzzed almost immediately with a reply. She glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. Caroline's at the flagship store tonight, she said. She wants to meet us. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Tonight? She doesn't waste time, does she? Alicia slipped her phone into her bag and straightened her jacket. Neither do I, she said, her voice steady. Let's go. As they pulled out of the parking lot, neither of them knew that Caroline was already deep in conversation with the store manager, and that Neil's actions were about to backfire in ways he never imagined. Back inside the store, Neil leaned against the security desk near the entrance, scrolling idly through his phone. He occasionally glanced up, scanning the crowd with what he believed was a practiced, discerning eye. His coworker Lisa approached him, her expression cautious. Neil, she began hesitantly, her voice low. Wasn't that a little harsh? That couple wasn't doing anything wrong. Neil scoffed and slipped his phone into his pocket. Harsh? Come on. Lisa, you saw them. They didn't belong here. Lisa frowned, her discomfort evident. They were just browsing like everyone else. They looked like they could afford half the store. Neil rolled his eyes. It's not about what they looked like. It's about keeping the atmosphere in here professional. People pay for exclusivity, not distractions. Lisa shook her head, clearly troubled. I don't know, Neil. It didn't feel right. Look, Neil said, his tone growing defensive. I've seen enough to know when something's off. I don't need a lecture. Before Lisa could respond, the store manager, a stern-looking man named Robert, appeared. His sharp gaze darted between Neil and Lisa. Neil, a word in my office, Robert said briskly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Neil straightened, brushing off Lisa's worried look. What's this about? He asked, forcing a casual tone as he followed Robert toward the back office. When the door shut behind them, Robert crossed his arms and leaned against the desk. We've got a problem, he said bluntly. A serious one. Neil furrowed his brow, confused. What are you talking about? Robert took a deep breath. A customer complaint just came through about you. The couple you escorted out. Do you know who they are? Neil shrugged, his confidence unwavering. No idea. Just some people who didn't belong. Robert's jaw tightened. That somebody happens to be close friends with Caroline Hastings. Do you know who Caroline Hastings is? Neil froze. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't place it. I think she's part of corporate. The regional director. Robert snapped. And she's on her way here right now. She's not happy. Neil, not one bit. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Neil opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time that night, the weight of his actions began to settle on him. Robert stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. I suggest you think carefully about how you're going to explain yourself, he said. This isn't going to blow over.